everyone.
Good afternoon.
My name is Kevin Shao, and I'm the president of the F Buckley Jr. program at Yale. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our conversation with Professor Nadine Strossen, entitled Combating Hate, Censorship, or Free Speech. Now, before we begin, I'd like to say a few words about the F Buckley Jr. program. The F Buckley Jr. program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and freedom of speech at Yale. We have hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 500 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale. By providing students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website at buckleyprogram.com. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest for today's discussion. New York Law School professor emerita Nadine Strossen, past national president of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1991 to 2008, is a senior fellow with FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and a leading expert and frequent speaker and media commentator on constitutional law and civil liberties. She has testified before Congress on multiple occasions and has been named by the National Law Journal as one of America's 100 most influential lawyers. Her most recent book is Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. Libby Snowden, our membership director for the William F. Buckley Jr. program, and a member of the class of 2024, will host today's interview. With that, I'll pass it off to Libby. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nadine Strossen to Yale and to the Buckley program.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you, Kevin, for that very kind introduction, and thank you again, Professor Strossen, for coming to speak with us today. I want to start off with just kind of an opening, broad question. Could you give us your elevator pitch about free speech, and specifically, considering the topic of your book, how it relates to combating hate?
So the elevator pitch for free speech is that no matter who you are, no matter what your interests are, no matter what your beliefs are, no matter what your commitments are, freedom of speech is the absolutely essential prerequisite for exploring and developing your own identity and for furthering whatever cause you believe in. If I may, I'll go, now we've reached the third floor, whatever floor we're on here, so let me just add one other point. Because I do continue to be completely committed to the ACLU's mission, which in my view parallels the mission of our government. Note that I say mission because it's an aspiration, and both institutions sometimes fall short of the aspiration, but basically to secure all fundamental freedoms for all people. No matter who you are and no matter what you believe, you are entitled to full and equal rights. And I am completely committed to all other human rights, but I believe that freedom of speech is the essential bedrock for all of the other human rights. And conversely, that censorship is the avowed enemy of the whole human rights agenda. That's my particular agenda, but yours is chemistry. Free speech is still important there, right, for scientific inquiry.
Absolutely. It's funny that we talk about free speech in the academic sense, in the social sense. Could you explain to us what your view is on the issue of free speech, particularly in higher education right now, and how that's changed since you were a college student?
You know, to some extent, there hasn't been that much of a change. And I know that people are now talking about, well, we have social media, and that leads to kind of a new way, a new mechanism for violating free speech. But it's basically the same old issues recycled in new factual and communications contexts. And I'm saying this because I recently was asked to write an article for Tablet magazine, and the editor asked me to write about why is the left abandoning free speech? And I said to him, you know, the left has been abandoning free speech throughout my entire adult lifetime, going back to when I was a college student myself. Of course, I was at Harvard. I'm sure you didn't have those problems at Yale in those days. And let me hasten to add that the right has also been attacking free speech throughout all of those periods. It basically comes down to what many people have quipped is the common attitude toward free speech, which is, I believe in freedom of speech for me, but not for thee. And it is very rare to find people, especially politicians or pundits or activists for particular causes, who will truly neutrally stand up even for freedom for the thought that we hate, to quote that famous line from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. So, you know, since I am a political liberal as well as a classical liberal, let me tell you that when I was in college back, you know, before you were all born, so that makes it ancient history, the Vietnam War was going on, and I was very strongly opposed to the war. I had started speaking against it even when I was in high school, and I continued that position when I was in college. But I became persona non grata on campus because, unlike others who were active in the anti-war movement, I did not think that we should deplatform members of the military or members of industry, business that were supporting the military effort. In other words, I supported their free speech rights. So, you know, a similar deplatforming is a term that has been bandied about a lot recently, but let me tell you, it goes back to your parents and your grandparents' generation, and even before that. When I graduated from law school, the American Civil Liberties Union, of which I was then just one of thousands of volunteer lawyers around the country, took on what to this day remains its most controversial case, the so-called Skokie case, in which, as many of you know, the ACLU, despite being on the forefront, or I would say because of being on the forefront of anti-discrimination efforts, you know, combating racism and anti-Semitism, therefore defended freedom of speech in the particular context where speech was trying to be exercised by racists, namely a group of neo-Nazis who wanted to demonstrate in Skokie, Illinois, a town near Chicago, that not only had a large Jewish population, but given the time, this was 1977 to 1978, many of them were literally Holocaust survivors themselves. And let me tell you, not only was that position extremely unpopular in the public at large, it was very unpopular among ACLU members. We lost 15% of our members, people who are such diehard free speech supporters that they forked over the money to become card-carrying ACLU members. It's only $20, by the way, and yes, that is a commercial. But you know, the principle that was at stake in that case is such a straightforward core principle of First Amendment law. The courts call it viewpoint neutrality or content neutrality, that government has to remain neutral toward the viewpoint, the content, the idea, or the message of the speech. And if you oppose the idea, then ignore it, debate it, refute it, and so forth, but don't suppress it. So our case was a hands-down winner in the courts of law. We went all the way up to the US Supreme Court. There was litigation in the state courts as well as the federal courts, and we easily won in the courts of law, but we lost in the courts of public opinion. So, you know, to me, it's part of the eternal struggle to convince people that they have to look beyond the particular speaker, the particular idea, to the underlying principle, and really understand that no matter what they believe, they're going to depend on that principle. And let me just give you one illustration, which was in the ACLU briefs in the Skokie case, that the very same arguments that were being made to stop the Nazis from speaking in Skokie, you know, that they're evil, that they're dangerous, that they're subversive, that they're threatening, those very same arguments had been made 10 years before in another town in Illinois with a very different demographic with respect to a very different speaker, namely Cicero, Illinois, in the southern part of the state. It's really, I don't know how many of you are familiar with geography of Illinois, but that's basically part of the South. And we were defending the free speech rights of Martin Luther King himself and civil rights demonstrators to demonstrate in Cicero. And their ideas were seen as dangerous and hated by the residents of Cicero as the Nazis' ideas were by the residents of Skokie. So, you know, I've been fighting these same battles for a long time. You can tell I never get tired of doing it, but I never succeed. I have to keep trying.
Well, I think you are succeeding. You have a whole room full of people right here who are very much on board, or at least very willing and excited to listen
Well,
to
if
your
I'm doing my job, they have to question free speech, right? Because
Right.
everything. I have to. Yeah, I can move. I'm not hard mic'd. I travel around with this prop, which, you know, especially in a conservative-leaning organization, don't get too excited. It's not exactly what you think it is. Can you read that? Okay.
Yes.
So it's make J.S. Mill great again, and I hope you all know who J.S. Mill was. I have to tell you, I have a lot of people who should know better who don't know. But I got this when I was speaking in the Czech Republic last fall for a wonderful little human rights group that had translated my hate speech book into Czech and brought me over on a book tour. And I saw this in the office of the executive director, and I just fell in love with it, so he gave it to me as a gift. But you know, Mill said, and I keep rereading him, I keep being open-minded, but I keep being persuaded that no idea is beyond questioning or challenging. And I believe that even about everything I've been telling you. So I hope that you're going to give me some hard, challenging questions.
For sure.
Not only you, but everybody else.
Yes. Well, you did mention the issue in Skokie, Illinois back in the 70s. And one thing that I've seen a lot from FIRE is FIRE is very principled. That's the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Is very principled about not taking a stance on the speech they defend.
Mm-hmm.
So I was curious, how do you contend with defending speech that you find abhorrent or you don't agree with? And do you feel that there's ever an instance where it makes sense or it's appropriate to say that you don't endorse the speech, but you're going to defend it nonetheless?
I would make that point about all speech, that I'm going to defend it regardless of whether I agree with it or not, that's irrelevant. Because I'm not defending the speech per se. I am defending an underlying principle that redounds to the benefit of all other speech. And I have to say my earlier book, which was published by a trade publisher, and it was my first such book, so I didn't have, I don't know, as an author, I did not have the right to participate in choosing the title. And the title is really kind of misleading because it's called Defending Pornography. The subtitle is Free Speech, Sex, and the Fight for Women's Rights. And that's misleading because it's suggesting a substantive defense of pornography. On the other hand, defending free speech for pornography starts to sound a little bit academic, but that's basically literally what it's about. And Libby, the other part of your question, is there any speech limit that I would support? The answer is yes, and this gives me an opportunity to put on my law professor hat and tell you a basic point about First Amendment law, which is so misunderstood and so often demonized and caricatured by those who attack it. They use a distorted version of what free speech is, and they accuse those of us who support it, including Supreme Court justices, of being absolutists, and we supposedly oppose any limit whatsoever on speech, and we even deny that speech causes any harm at all. No, no, no. First Amendment law, which, by the way, is supported pretty much unanimously by all modern Supreme Court justices, and this is very, noteworthy, right? Because we know that these are justices who deeply disagree with each other on many constitutional issues, including some First Amendment issues, certainly including the religion clauses. But on freedom of speech, you get pretty much every single one of them, from the most extreme on one side to the most extreme on the other end of the spectrum, supporting the fundamental viewpoint neutrality principle. And both, the liberals have supported freedom of speech for right-wing hate mongers, and the conservatives have supported freedom of speech for communist flag burners. They get it. And I think what's kind of interesting, as I ask myself, why is it that the public objects so much to controversial speech that the Supreme Court defends freedom to engage in? And I think the answer is that the justices know what the law is, and they also know the history that gave rise to it, what the actual experience was under more speech restrictive regimes in this country, and how dangerous it was not only to individual liberty, but also to equality and also to democracy itself. So in a nutshell, our First Amendment law is very sensible. It outlaws the speech that is the most dangerous, and it also outlaws the censorship that is the most dangerous. So the most dangerous speech is often described under the rubric, the emergency test, speech that directly and imminently causes or threatens certain specific serious harm. And the Supreme, and such that, the only way to avert the harm is through suppressing the speech. There's no less speech restrictive alternative. If there were, you'd have to use it, such as education or law enforcement. And the Supreme Court has recognized several subcategories of speech that satisfy the emergency test. Some of these will sound familiar. One is intentional incitement of imminent violence that is actually likely to happen imminently. People have talked about that exception a lot in the context of January 6th, and it's all of these tests are very fact-specific because they go beyond the content of the speech and look at it in the overall context. So one factual change might make a big difference in how the case comes out. Another example of speech that satisfies the emergency principle is what lawyers call a true threat, to distinguish it from the rather casual way we use the term threat in everyday life. I've had students say, I feel threatened that so-and-so is speaking on my campus. No, that is not enough to justify punishing it. But when the speaker targets a particular individual or small group of individuals and intends to instill a reasonable fear that they are going to be subject to attack, that is a punishable true threat. And note that the speaker doesn't have to intend to carry out the violence. It's enough to instill a reasonable, which is an objective fear, because if you fear that you're going to be subject to attack, that already hampers your freedom of movement and your freedom of speech. So I could give many other examples, but the law does allow suppression of speech when it is posing the most danger. But it outlaws the censorship that is the most dangerous, and that's censorship that is based either solely on disfavor of the viewpoint or the content, as we already talked about, or that has a looser, more attenuated, more speculative connection between the speech and the harm. And that's the standard that we used to have in this country and that many other countries still have. It's usually called the bad tendency test, that speech that might potentially, indirectly, at some future point, cause some harm is enough to justify censoring it. And that's why Martin Luther King wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. Why was he in prison? He was in prison for trying to exercise what we now understand to be First Amendment rights. And the same thing is true for all crusaders for law reform, all dissidents from government policy, critics of government officials throughout our history were constantly suppressed under that looser bad tendency test.
And I feel like I've done some reading and found that today, a lot of countries in Western Europe in particular do have hate speech laws and laws that attempt to censor speech that might be termed or deemed offensive or harmful or hateful. So how have those laws gone over in Western Europe, and why don't they work here?
It's very interesting, Libby, that in our country we have many people, I've already alluded to this, who are not supporters of the robust free speech protection that I'm advocating and that more importantly, that the Supreme Court has upheld. So there are people in this country who think that we should censor more hate speech or more disinformation, was also a very popular target these days, or extremist speech or terrorist speech. And notice I'm using scare quotes for all of these terms because they are all inherently, irreducibly, unavoidably subjective concepts, right? And that means that whoever has the power to enforce laws against that kind of nebulous speech has enormous discretionary power, which is inevitably going to be exercised either in accordance with their own subjective values or those of powerful constituent groups in their communities. And that's why, under the looser bad tendency test, and in countries around the world that allow punishment of hate speech, they disproportionately target anybody who is unpopular as an individual, who is powerless, relatively disempowered as a matter of demographic or religious groups, or whose ideas are dissident or unpopular. And just as we have people in this country who want to move closer to the European model, we have many human rights activists in European countries, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, you name it, who oppose censoring hate speech and want to move more in the direction of the United States, not because their own national constitutions protect free speech. They don't. I mean, they don't to the same extent that we do, but purely from the perspective of what is effective, that no matter how well intended, these laws end up silencing the very people whose speech is intended to be amplified. And my book gives hundreds of examples from countries all over the world.
And then I want to ask one more question before we move into audience Q&A. So we're obviously the William F. Buckley Jr. program, and I know that you had the opportunity to do many debates with William F. Buckley Jr. himself, both on TV and in person, and including the campus lecture circuit. What can you tell us about these interactions and any insights that they provide for civil discourse on campus and in society at large?
Well, Bill Buckley and I strongly disagreed on more issues than those on which we agreed, but there, as with everybody, there are, and believe me, I've debated every opponent of every civil liberties position throughout my adult lifetime, and I cannot think of an exception to this generalization, that no matter how strongly we disagree on many important issues that are deeply important to both of us, we also have at least some important issues important to both of us on which we agree. And in Bill Buckley's case, I would say the most important, because at that time there was almost no liberal support for the position, was drug decriminalization or legalization. He, as an individual, and the National Review as an institution, a publication, really led the way in advocating for decriminalization of drugs at a time when the left would not touch that issue with a 10-foot pole, right? The ACLU was pretty much a voice in the wilderness, and we had the Democrats were definitely moving, wanted to have the tough on crime mantle in hopes of being elected. And the Black Congressional Caucus was on the other side. on this as well as other criminal justice issues for reasons that had to do with concerns about safety in their own communities and drug problems in their own communities. So I really, in that sense, had shared something with him. But I think the main thing that we shared was something that cannot at all be taken for granted now, and that is not only a willingness, but an enthusiasm to engage in conversations with people who have differing perspectives. I think debate might not even be an accurate term, although there were some, single issue debates on some of the TV shows, but usually it's a discussion where you're not just trying to score debating points, where you're actually trying to gain understanding and appreciation for positions that might be slightly different from your own. And he had, he was so eloquent and so smart and so well read and had such a great sense of humor. It was absolutely a delight to share the podium with him. And one thing that I miss very much about him, and also about Nino Scalia, with whom I also did lecture, discussion, debate programs around the world, is that both of them, I think they're both known for their witty barbs against people they disagree with. I remember one of the debates that he set up for Firing Line, the debate proposition, which he said somebody on his staff that he himself didn't craft, but the debate proposition was the ACLU is full of baloney. But when we started doing the debate, he said, in this aristocratic drawl of his, he said, well, I mean, if I had written that debate proposition, I would have said the ACLU is filled with pâté de foie gras. So, he and Scalia both would make fun of themselves, too. It was like, everything is open to criticism with a good sense of humor. And then on a very pragmatic level, let me say that on the campus lecture circuit, one is usually given a dinner before or after the event with the students, and because of the strict alcohol rules on campus, something else that he and I agreed was bad public policy as well as not good for civil liberties. But he would always come with his own bottles of wine, which he would happily share with me. So I very much miss, and a very fine wine collection. Plus, he would drink a lot more of it, so I've sort of thought that gave me a little bit of an advantage in the debate.
Well, that's a great anecdote to end the formal portion of the interview on. Thank you for your thoughtful responses to all of my questions. And now we're going to move into audience Q&A. It looks like Kevin's going to be running the mic around, so by all means, let's get going.
Appreciate it. Hi, nice to meet you. Thank you for coming. So my question is about the difference between censorship and actively platforming. I think there's a difference between taking speech away from someone and muffling their voice and just choosing not to give them a massive platform and blow up their voice. You wouldn't give equal runtime to ideas that were patently not clear. And in an age run by social media, how do we reconcile that? How do we determine when it's okay to not platform ideas that are incorrect or blatantly wrong?
So let me start by acknowledging a really important point that you're making, which is in certain contexts, it is completely not only appropriate, but indeed professionally responsible to make certain content-based determinations. I would still hope that they would not be so much viewpoint-based, but when you have a limited communications resource, and we faculty members deal with this all the time. Well, first of all, a university can't offer every single possible course, right? So it has to decide what is on the curriculum. Each professor can't possibly assign every single piece that's ever been written on the topic that he or she or they are teaching. And so one has to make decisions about how to allocate these precious resources. And you're talking about something analogous. I have no right to be invited to speak to this wonderful program. I'm very happy that you chose to give me one of the opportunities, but even if this had been a public university, I would not have had a First Amendment lawsuit for not having been invited. So I think that one should take very seriously the limited opportunity and use it strategically to invite speakers who are going to contribute to the enterprise of the university. Now that said, I don't think, as I indicated earlier, I don't think that viewpoint should be a criterion. I think that it would, because I'm making the substantive judgment that I think in an academic context, it is really important for students to be exposed to a range of viewpoints. But I would be very selective. I would not get somebody who is just a provocateur. Forgive me if you disagree, you might disagree with this, but I think Milo Yiannopoulos was just a lot of hot air and not really contributing something substantive. Whereas take William F. Buckley as exactly the opposite, somebody whose viewpoints you may strongly disagree with, but who is a very thoughtful, effective advocate. I would defend bringing him to campus, but I would also defend the right of a department or of a student organization to make a different determination. Now, once somebody has been invited and a decision is made to revoke that invitation because of protest or pressure, from various elements on campus, I think that's different. That's a horse of a different color, because that suggests that the reason for backing down is related solely to disagreement with the viewpoint. If you want to push back, I'd love that if we have time. Okay. I saw somebody up here. Oh, Kevin's running around.
Thanks so much for the answer. I'm still a little bit confused because it seems like...
Yeah, I saw that on your face, though. Yeah.
It seems like there's an idea that we can restrain viewpoints. At one point I heard you say that we shouldn't restrain content based on viewpoints.
That was deliberately government suppression and censorship, and you made the excellent distinction about contexts where there's just... the classic situation that I'm alluding to is the Skokie kind of situation where it's a public forum and there's basically no limit to the number of people or groups that can be marching. You might want to say, at a particular time you can have only one parade, but it's not the limited kind of resource that I took it you were alluding to. I may have been reading too much into your question, but I thought you were talking about like university invited speakers.
Well, yes, but also things like Twitter. Like, does anybody have a right to a platform on Twitter or anything else for that matter if their viewpoint is, you said yourself that we have to be somewhat selective about viewpoints. And so the question is not necessarily do we be selective at all? It seems patently yes. Yeah. But the question is, how do we be selective in a fair manner? And I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
So social media, thank you for flagging that, because I made a reference during one of Libby's answering one of Libby's questions that the free speech analysis is very fact specific. And so if we're talking about social media, that's a really important factor that affects the analysis. Most importantly, because the social media companies are private companies, and therefore they are not bound by the First Amendment at all. They have no obligation to not discriminate on the basis of viewpoint, and they essentially, not only do they not have to respect our free speech rights as potential platform users, they have, as communications enterprises, they have their own free speech rights to decide what speakers to host, what not, what viewpoints to host, and what not. Twitter's terms of service say this literally, but even if they didn't say it literally, it would still legally be the case. We can kick you off at any time for any reason or no reason. That is literally the case, although, as Professor Goodrow and I were talking about, there's a lot of litigation and discussion going on right now, including One of the professors at Yale Law School was really one of the thought leaders, Jed Rubenfeld, starting about a year or two ago. He and others, again, an ideological cross-section, interestingly enough, have argued that the tech giants wield so much power and provide such essential services for meaningful participation in our democratic republic, in our society, in our political and economic sphere, that they should be treated as essential infrastructure, similar to the landline telephone in the past and the telegraph in the past, and that therefore they should be treated, there are several kind of overlapping legal doctrines. They should be treated as a common carrier or as a public utility or as a public accommodation. And a couple of states have passed laws imposing those. And basically what that means is that they would have to serve as neutral conduits that would lose the editorial discretion to make decisions about who could speak and who could not speak, and just would be required to neutrally, non-discriminatorily, fairly serve all comers, just the way the phone company can't deny service to a member of the KKK or anybody else whose views they might disagree with. And one law was passed in Florida, one was passed in Texas. They were immediately litigated against by a consortium of the tech companies, arguing that these laws violate their First Amendment free speech rights. And showing how complicated the issue is, the court in Florida came out one way, the court in Texas came out the other way, federal appellate courts, the US Supreme Court ostensibly determining a procedural issue, but it gives a little bit of a hint about where they're leading, decided 5-4 on the procedural issue. So this is a very, very difficult question, and I have to tell you, I've been asked to sign amicus briefs, friend of the court briefs on both sides, and I had to say to both sides, I don't know, it's too hard. I haven't made up my mind yet. So I consulted the person I consider the free speech expert that I admire the most in this country, with all due respect to everybody else, but it's Jeff Stone at the University of Chicago. And I asked, and Jeff just edited an entire book on social media. And so I said, well, you must have done a lot of thinking about this. And he said, I've done so much thinking that I'm more confused than ever, and I don't know what the outcome should be. And if you can bear with me, I'd like to make one other really important point, that our law, again, I think is so sensible. The more you know about it, the more it resonates with common sense. So even though it's true that the Constitution directly binds only the government itself, if the government is sufficiently, here's the legal term we use, sufficiently entangled with a particular private sector entity or action, either through coercion or through coordination or through collusion, so that what is ostensibly a private sector actor really is reflecting pressure and involvement from the government, then that should be treated as government conduct. The government should not be able to farm out its censorial, pressures to Twitter and Facebook that would violate the First Amendment if the government did it directly, should not be able to pressure them to do it. And a lot of these cases now are raising a lot of evidence that decisions to deplatform certain people or certain perspectives, including disinformation about election, alleged disinformation about COVID, that is not the private sector company's own decision. They're doing it because of veiled threats, and sometimes not so veiled threats from a lot of politicians. You better do this, or we're going to bring an antitrust case against you, we're going to repeal your Section 230 immunity. So, I mean, it's a very, very interesting, evolving area that's presenting the same old issues in very, very new formats.
All right, we've got another question in the back.
Thank you for joining us, Professor. Good evening. I'm interested, you've constantly brought up how there's kind of a cross-sectional as far as the academics are considered in law schools about the importance of free speech and how it should be able to be brought back and no longer so much of a left-right issue. And today, it's kind of that the right is viewed as the champion of free speech But it hasn't always been like that, as I'm sure you know. So I'm curious about back when the right used to kind of advocate against the expansion of First Amendment rights, kind of with New York Times v. Sullivan. What do you think then how far do you think First Amendment rights have come? Do you think that there's any room for saying that even with the context of government oppression, they have gone too far? Should a media company be able to report with impunity something that is false, even if they don't have accurate sources or like anonymous sources, like we constantly saw happening during the Trump administration and even now under the Biden administration?
So you've made at least two separate but interrelated points that I want to respond to. First, I want to reiterate that throughout my entire adult lifetime and crusading about free speech, I have constantly been fighting what I consider to be censorship from both the right and the left. The only thing they often, but not always, disagree about is exactly what speech should be censored. But the reason I say sometimes they don't even disagree about that, I mentioned that I wrote this book defending free speech for pornography in the early 90s because we had a strange bedfellows coalition then between the so-called religious right and conservatives under President Ronald Reagan and his Attorney General, Ed Meese, and with a lot of support from organizations of the religious right, including the Moral Majority and Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum, who were attacking pornography for undermining what they called the traditional American family and traditional family values, that sexuality and images and depictions of sexuality had to be confined to that traditional moral conservative concept. At the very same time, you had so-called radical feminists from the left who were crusading against pornography because they saw it as undermining and endangering women's safety and women's equality. And these two groups that, radically disagreed about exactly which sexual expression should be demonized as pornography still had this concept that whatever sexual expression is inconsistent with their views of appropriate sexuality and limits on sexuality should be subject to repression. So on point number one, I just really want to say the problems are all across the political spectrum, and they always have been. And then your second point, I'm so sorry, you're going to have to repeat it. I haven't had enough go. The excesses, including defamation, yes. So again, I think our law is very sensible. It does not outlaw lies or misleading information, or to use the loose terms today, disinformation or misinformation, but consistent with that emergency principle. If the false or misleading speech directly, imminently causes or threatens certain specific harm, then it can be punished. So we have several categories of speech, false speech, that satisfies that standard. You alluded to one of them, which is defamation, and that is when the speaker intentionally lies or recklessly lies in a way that damages somebody's reputation, leading to demonstrable harm, and usually it's financial harm. And when we're talking about defamation of, alleged defamation of public officials or public figures, as you well know, you alluded to the historic case, New York Times versus Sullivan, the Supreme Court said, we don't want to have a chilling effect on people who are engaged in criticism of public officials or public figures, and they might be so deterred by the fear that they might lose. You know, they might be telling the truth, but they might lose in a court of law, or it's very expensive to prove it in a court of law. That's going to have too much of a deterrent effect. So we're going to create this prophylactic rule that protects even some speech that is defamatory. I think the good analogy is most of us have heard this saying that we'd rather let 10 guilty persons go free than one innocent person be convicted. So the Supreme Court has done the same with respect to free speech, that we're willing to pay the price of letting some speech that is harmful and could constitutionally be punished, but we're going to create rules that give some, the court calls it breathing space, so that people are not unnecessarily deterred from saying things that are critical that might satisfy the defamation standard. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the factual situation. I'm sure not everybody's familiar with the factual situation that gave rise to the Sullivan case. It was very similar to most of our landmark free speech cases arose in the context of the civil rights movement, because censorship was the major tool that was being used to try to suppress the movement. I already alluded to MLK being in jail for trying to peacefully protest. The defamation law, as a matter of tort law, before the Supreme Court said we've got to put First Amendment limits on it, was so strict. It was basically what lawyers call strict liability. You make one inaccurate statement, even if you used due care, so it's not intentional, it's not even negligent, but it happens to be false, and even if it's trivial, and even if it doesn't damage somebody's reputation and doesn't cause them financial injury, you're still automatically going to be subject to punitive damages. And so using that very strict approach to defamation, the southern states had a deliberate strategy of bringing defamation lawsuits not only against civil rights leaders and civil rights organizations, but also against the national media that were trying to bring public attention, national attention, to the cause, with the deliberate intent of trying to bankrupt them. And let me tell you, the New York Times alone had, multiple defamation lawsuits that were pending against it. And I don't remember how the numbers translate into today's dollars, but the damages that were imposed just in that one case back in the early 1960s was $500,000, and that obviously worth a lot more in today. So very, very serious. And the Supreme Court understood that the movement itself and the drive for equality, as well as the free speech rights, would be thwarted if the court did not rein it in.
All right, I think we had some questions down here and in the back there too.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. So this is in a slightly different direction, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how free speech and viewpoint diversity relate to a lot of the controversies we're seeing today in K-12 education. So I'm thinking of states like Florida, where the state curricula are being regulated at the state level, and also states like New York, where there is a statewide, for instance, DEI curricula that can be seen as overtly partisan.
Yeah, these are such difficult issues because you have, in a way, the conflicts over school curricula and to some extent over school library books epitomize the tension that we have in our constitutional system between two fundamental norms. One is the norm that we are a democratic republic. Popular, majorities have the power to elect representatives who decide what policy decisions to implement. And basically, electorally accountable officials can decide most public policy issues, except there are some rights that are so fundamental that no majority can take them away from any minority. But, you know, there's an intersection there because the locally elected school boards and other officials kind of epitomize local community control. And the Supreme Court has recognized over and over again that they are inevitably vested with a great deal of discretion to make determinations about what should be in the curriculum, what should not be, what books should be in the library, what should not be. And the Supreme Court has been very reluctant to become, in effect, a super school board, you know, looking into, and as a practical matter, it could not possibly look into all of these decisions that are made at the local level. But the Supreme Court has said in a number of cases, when constitutional rights are sharply and directly implicated, then it is appropriate for courts to intervene. And historically, the situations where the courts have done that have involved violations of the non-establishment clause. So to strike down government-mandated prayers in public schools, or to strike down bans on the teaching of evolution in public schools when the only reason for doing that was to promote a certain religious viewpoint. But when it comes to these more delicate decisions about the curriculum, let me tell you, the Supreme Court has issued only one decision. It was way back in 1982. The court was so fragmented, it did not have a majority opinion. It only had a so-called plurality opinion, and there were 4 justices who dissented, so it was a 4-4 tie. The 9th justice basically said, you know, this is uncharted territory. I'll tell you how I come out on these facts, but I can't come up with a rationale. And a lot of legal experts say, well, that's not even precedential authority because there was no majority vote for the rationale. But let me tell you the basic arguments here. Basically, if it all goes to what is the reason for making certain decisions. And it's similar to the question that I was asked earlier about platforms. If the reason for deciding that something should be or should not be in the curriculum is some neutral concern about educational suitability or age appropriateness, that's something where the court is not an expert. It should defer to the educational experts, including the school boards. But if the only reason for deciding that something should or should not be in the curriculum or the library is because of viewpoint discrimination, or worse yet, discrimination against certain people, then that does directly and sharply implicate the First Amendment. Let me say that even the 4 justices who disagreed in that particular case did say, well, in an extreme example, this case happened to involve removal of books from a school library. Even the dissenters who really wanted to give a great deal of discretion to the school board said, well, if the only reason for taking out library books is because they were all written by black people or, you know, Asian people, or they were all written by Republicans, or they, you know, like narrow demographic identity discrimination or narrow partisan discrimination, then that should be struck down. So if I can just make one more point, I understand the impetus behind a lot of the legislation to avoid indoctrination that we hear is going on in many of our classrooms. But if these laws are, you know, they're examples of the cure being worse than the disease. And I know conservatives that I respect who are very concerned about woke, progressive indoctrination. I'm concerned about any kind of indoctrination. I don't care really what the ideology is. But even they say, you know, we agree that this is a problem, but we think that the legislation is even more of a problem because it's so vague and it's so overbroad that it's even creating more problems than it's solving.
Yeah, I think so too.
Thank you. So the argument that I am kind of hearing from you here is that it is kind of hypocritical for someone to say, I think that certain views should be allowed to be expressed, but others shouldn't. And this is inconsistent because, if I want to express my views, then you should get to express your views. So another way to phrase that might be like, insofar as I have a desire to be given free speech about my opinions, I kind of have to, in order to be consistent, believe in free speech universally. So, this has some intuitive appeal, but I don't actually think it's right, logically at least. Because what if I just said, well, no, actually, I think that some views should be allowed to be expressed because they're good and true and right, and other views should be censored because they're pernicious, they're wrong, and they're bad. And this isn't that crazy. Like, we think about this with our kids. I don't have kids, but people think about this with their kids. Like, there are things that I want them to learn, and there are things that I want them not to learn, and I can kind of discern and give reasons for why some things are good and some are bad. So, addressing this as like a logical, philosophical argument and not a legal argument, what is the response there?
And I agree with all of the points that you made. So first of all of us have not only a right, but I would say in many contexts, whether it be as a professor or whether it be as a parent or a guardian, to raise our voices, to affirmatively support the ideas that we think are true and right, and to criticize those that we think are not. So, there's a lot, and the title of my book, I see some people have it there, is, hate, why we should resist it with free speech, not censorship. So I'm saying we should resist certain ideas, including hateful and discriminatory ideas. But the way to do it is through our own exercise of free speech, which could be a whole panoply of mechanisms. It doesn't have to be answering back. It could be ignoring it, trying to shun it. Now that gets to the second point, which is government censorship is not necessarily an effective way to drive those pernicious ideas out of the marketplace of ideas. And here I do go through a logical analysis in my book, because one of my complaints is that very, very often the argument in favor of censorship really starts and ends with the point that this speech is bad, this speech is dangerous, this speech is harmful. The leading book that takes a different perspective from mine, written by Jeremy Waldron, with whom I've discussed and debated many times. He's a professor at NYU. The title of his book says it all. It's The Harm in Hate Speech. Yeah, I agree that hate speech is harmful, but it doesn't logically follow that an effective strategic response is government censorship. Logically, before censorship could be justified, we'd have to show that censorship would materially reduce either the amount of hate speech or its harmful impact. Number two, that there would not be material, unforeseen, adverse consequences, such as punishing other speech, because the concept is so vague and so overbroad that a lot of valuable, non-hateful speech gets swept up in the concept of government censorship. And number three, we'd have to ask, is there any less speech restrictive alternative that could be as effective or maybe even more effective in countering the hateful ideas? And I truly, when I started research for the book, I was as open-minded as I could be. I looked at all the evidence that had accumulated since the last time I had delved into the issue, and I became more convinced than ever that censorship, no matter how well intended, ends up doing more harm than good. I mean, think about, this is, oh, by the way, I forgot to say Happy Constitution Week, Happy Freedom to Read Week. And every time I hear about a banned book, I buy it, right? And that's, it's not to make a point, it's just I learn about the book and it sounds really interesting. And that's such a common phenomenon. We talk about the forbidden fruits phenomenon. And I already mentioned one of the other unintended adverse consequences, which is these censorial laws give so much discretion to the enforcing authorities that they end up using the power disproportionately against the very ideas and speakers that are intended to be benefited. So does that sound a little bit more logical? Thank you.
All right, and with that, we have reached the end of our program for this evening. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Professor Strossen, for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you all very much. Great questions. They weren't very hard questions, so. You had a question. May I answer it?
If it's possible.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if we can break ranks.
I mean, if anyone needs to leave, obviously feel free to leave, but
Okay.
by all means. Yeah, there's a bunch of cookies back there, but
Save one for me, please.
by all means, go ahead.